Welcome everyone to the Indiana Organic Network's 2025 webinar series. My name is Ashley Adair. I'm the Extension Organic Agriculture Specialist here at Purdue University. I am based out of the Horticulture and Landscape Architecture Department on Purdue's campus in West Lafayette. We are joined by Brian Overstreet, who is one of the conservation agronomists with Conservation Cropping Systems Initiative of Indiana, as well as Purdue Extension. We're both part of the Indiana Organic Network project that you can see here on this first slide. This webinar is supported by this NIFA ORG Organic Transitions Grant. The grant is called Empowering Indiana's Organic Farmers, Assessing Regional and Farm-Scale Soil Health with a Farmer Network. So the goals of this project are twofold. One is to conduct a soil health census here in the state of Indiana on organic, transitioning, and practicing organic farms. So those that are practicing organic practices but may not be certified. And then the other part of this project is to provide educational opportunities and networking opportunities to growers such as yourselves. So we are excited to be able to present this webinar series so far this spring. We have completed one webinar. We conducted one in March on organic transition for specialty crop growers. You can find the recording of that webinar on the Indiana Organic Network's website. And Brian, if you want to put that in the chat for folks who are attending, that would be fantastic. You can find our recordings on the resources page. So the only webinar we have recorded so far is that organic transition one. We will record this webinar as well and have that posted within the next few weeks so that you can go back and look at that later on. So without further ado, let's get into the rest of our presentation this evening. So we are going to be discussing companion planting this evening. Fact or fiction? So there's a lot of anecdotes that float around in the companion planting space. So I'm here to bring you some of the evidence-based or not methods around companion planting and what that might mean for you and your farm or market garden. So what is companion planting? Companion planting is essentially a type of intercropping. So this means growing two or more crops together in the same field. Companion planting is the practice of growing different plants nearby each other to benefit each individual plant. So the idea being that there are some benefits to both sets of plants when you're growing in a companion planting situation. So, like I said before, there are many anecdotes surrounding companion planting. And some of these you might find in popular publications such as the Farmer's Almanac. So there's a companion planting guide there that they've done a pretty good job recently of editing the Farmer's Almanac companion planting guide to show some evidence-based companion planting options, which is an improvement over the past. But there's also other popular publications out there that provide a lot of different anecdotes and stories, and in some cases, some evidence-based support for certain types of companion plantings. One popular publication is this Carrots Love Tomatoes and Roses Love Garlic. If you are a master gardener or you have been involved with any master gardeners in the past, this is a guide that you may have seen before. So again, there's a lot of anecdotes in the space, but we're going to find out a little bit more about what the science says so that you can plan your crops, your crop rotation, your planting schedule around some of these companion planting options that might work better than some of the others. There are several common themes behind companion planting. So several of the ones that are reasonably popular are listed here. So they include herbs emitting various volatile compounds that can help repel pest insects. Also, tall plants physically providing cooling shade for smaller plants. There's some companion plants that trap pests or maybe attract the pests, depending on how you look at it. Some plants have different root architecture than others that may benefit both plants if they're planted close together. Some crops will physically support others, so providing a trellis for another plant to climb on. Companion planting can also be a space-saving measure. So if you find plants that, quote, get along well together and you can plant them closer together, that is one way that you can save space in a smaller garden space. And there are some anecdotes and thoughts about one crop potentially improving another crop's flavor or scent. So, one common one is planting onions or garlic or leeks with rose bushes to help improve the scent of the rose. We'll find out a little bit more about that here in just a few minutes. So, some companion plants work, but we're not entirely sure why. We don't know the mechanisms behind why certain companion planting options might work better than others. And furthermore, there are many companion planting options that may work well in one garden or on one farm, but not on every farm, in every garden, or for every condition. So, some things to consider that will vary quite a bit from place to place when you're considering companion planting include your soil type and soil health. So, thinking about your drainage conditions, thinking about the amount of organic matter that might be in the soil that could be influencing how each plant performs in a companion planting situation. You might also consider climate and weather conditions. Some years might be more favorable or less favorable for a particular companion planting pairing. You might also consider cultivar or variety. And an example of that I can think of is if you're using tomato plants in your garden, a hybrid tomato is going to behave differently than an heirloom tomato in many cases. The growth habits will be different. The quality of the fruit's going to be different. Productivity is going to be different. And cultivar and variety may have an influence on how companion plants interact with each other, just as they have an influence on these characteristics like yield, plant architecture, and so on. And then finally, the type of habitat that you are growing in might have an influence. So, Northwest Indiana is kind of a windswept prairie. There's wide open spaces, lots of light, different soil types. That habitat looks a lot different from Southern Indiana, where we have more rolling hills, more woods, different types of soils that drain differently, and so on, and also different wildlife that might be interacting with these systems. So it's important to consider that there's a lot of variables when it comes to trying to suss out whether a companion planting pairing might be good for your home, your garden, or your farm, and whether it might not be so good. And then we can also think about the scientific method. So yes, there's a wall of text here, but there's a method to this madness. Wanted to go over the scientific method just to refresh memories or clue you in a little bit on how scientific research works, since we'll be discussing a handful of scientific studies in this presentation tonight. So there's five main components of the scientific method. One of them, the first one, is to state the problem. So, stating the problem will help you organize your thoughts around how you're going to study or experiment on this particular issue at hand. So, for example, this experiment will study the effects of marigold plantings on nearby tomato yield and pathogen presence, is an example of a type of problem statement that you might say when you're getting ready to set up an experiment. Step two is to form your hypothesis. So describing what you think the result of your study might be. If maybe you have an idea of what you expect to happen at the end of the experiment, so you would construct your hypothesis around what you think might happen. So for example, if marigolds are planted near tomatoes, tomatoes will be affected by fewer pathogens. And kind of as an extension of that, maybe tomato yield will improve or fruit quality will improve or something like that. You don't always want to get super complicated with your hypothesis, especially in some of these situations where we're looking at maybe one or two variables at once. But as your studies become more complicated, your hypothesis might become more complicated. So step three is to observe and experiment. So either observe the situation at hand or set up an experiment where you're testing variables against your hypothesis, and then you'll tally up your data. I think they say that the difference between science and observation in general is writing everything down. So if you set up an experiment, Make sure you have an organized way to tally up your data, and then you can interpret your data, which is step 4. So once you've collected all that data, you have to try to understand what that data is telling you. Maybe the data is not telling you anything that can be interpreted effectively, or maybe that data is showing you a really strong signal that maybe your hypothesis is either correct or incorrect, or showing that your hypothesis, there's enough data to support your hypothesis versus not supporting your hypothesis. So finally, number 5, you can draw some conclusions. So, did your observations or your experiments support your hypothesis? Was there a strong correlation? Were there things that you might consider changing about your experiment to make it better next time? This happens a lot in science. There's a lot of thinking out through data interpretation and conclusions to figure out if we did this again next time, what would we change about this experiment? What questions might we need to ask next time to study this further, and so on. So, as an example, should we adjust the distance that the marigolds have been planted in relation to the tomato plants? Should we plant a greater density of marigolds near the tomato plants? Or should we test different varieties of either marigold or tomato? So, there's a lot that goes into this scientific method and scientific inquiry. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is come back to that hypothesis and figure out if the question that we're asking that hypothesis is supported by the data or is not supported by the data. And just a word on kind of significance. So the word significance gets used a lot in the scientific literature. So when we're interpreting data and drawing conclusions, we'll use terms like not significantly different or significantly different to describe results that are meaningful. Significance, this word is kind of built from the statistical analysis that is done on the data that you've tallied. So basically, if something is deemed significantly different or statistically significantly different, it essentially means that there is a less than 5% chance that the results were due to random chance versus an actual effect of your experiment. So you're 95% confident essentially that the experiment that you did, that the signals that you're seeing in the data is related to the variables that you're testing instead of just random chance or random happenstance. So oftentimes studies are set up on multiple sites over multiple years to help reduce the risk that random chance is influencing what's going on in your experiment more so than the variables that you're testing. So that's just a real kind of a basic look at significance and how the scientific method works and how that informs what we will be talking about, looking at the scientific evidence for some of these companion planting options in the next several slides. Before we get there, however, I want to explain a few different symbols that you might be seeing in this presentation this evening. So I've put together a few different symbols that show when we're looking at a companion planting pairing in these slides, you'll see these different icons that kind of explain, are we looking at insects? Are we looking at scent or taste? Are we looking at nematodes? Are we looking at the environment? So that'll make more sense as we get into the presentation. What should make sense right away right now is the check mark X and the question mark. So at the top right corner of each slide, with each companion planting pairing, you'll end up seeing a check mark if there's a good chance that that companion planting strategy works well. You'll see an X if that strategy does not work well. And then finally, you will see a question mark if your mileage may vary. That's what that YMMV stands for there. It usually means that there haven't been enough studies done or that the jury is still out, so to speak, on whether or not that companion planting is making scientific sense. So those are the symbols to keep an eye out for. The first companion planting that we're going to look at is actually a traditional North American indigenous practice that you may have heard of before. So I wanted to bring up a historical example that is pretty well time tested and has some pretty good interrelationships between each of the plants involved in this companion planting. This is called the Three Sisters planting. This is a term that was primarily used by the Iroquois Native Americans in the northeastern part of the United States and eastern Canada, but it has now been used across the continent to describe this practice of planting corn, beans, and squash together in the same planting. So the idea behind this is that each species in this Three Sisters planting is benefiting each other in some way. So this is the very definition of companion planting. I think this serves as a strong basis, as an example to show what companion planting should look like in practice. So, for example, in the Three Sisters planting, corn stalks are providing support as a trellis for beans to climb on. Beans are returning nitrogen to the soil for both the squash and the corn that are planted there together. The squash is helping to shade out weeds, in addition to a certain extent to help defend the corn and beans from herbivory by animals, partly because the squash has some spiny, kind of spiky texture to the leaves, and is also obscuring those plants to a certain extent. However, I will say I have never met a raccoon that was able to keep its hands out of a planting like this. So maybe the defense from herbivory, maybe that one's a little ambiguous, but that's the idea behind each of these species helping each other out in this planting. So this method has been shown to work reasonably well in modern plantings, but maybe the major drawback is that this method is not ideal for mechanized agriculture. So it's not easy to go in and harvest all the crops that are grown in this circumstance by machine. And that's not really the point. Three Sisters gardening and farming is done on a smaller scale, at a much more human scale. But it is something to consider with some of these companion planting options that one of the drawbacks might be that you have many, many plants growing in one space together, and it might make it more difficult to use mechanical means of harvesting, or it might make it more challenging for you with your human hands to find some of the crops that you're intending to harvest. Before we move on, I want to mention that many of the companion planting examples that follow this evening are not as mutualistic as this Three Sisters planting. In some cases, the companion plant that is listed is doing most of the work, and it's not necessarily that each plant is benefiting the other one in some way. It's usually one plant is doing most of the work or providing most of the benefit that is listed in each example. But we'll still refer to these plantings as companions throughout the presentation for the sake of simplicity. So the first example that we'll see this evening is tomato and marigold. So you see that little icon there, that is a little worm that indicates that tomatoes and marigolds planted together are going to potentially have an effect on nematode species that exist in the soil. If you are not familiar with nematodes, nematodes are essentially a tiny, tiny, most of the time microscopic species of worm that lives in the soil, and many of them are plant pathogenic, meaning that they will attack the roots of various species. There's a lot of species specific associations with nematodes, and will use little piercing mouth parts that are essentially like straws that'll pierce into the plant tissue of the root and siphon water and nutrients away from the plant. If you get a whole bunch of these attacking a plant at once, that can be detrimental to yield and overall health of the plant. And in some cases, there are nematodes that will gather together in enough quantity and cause enough damage that plants like tomatoes can get a condition called root knot, which is formed by root knot nematodes. And those root knots can prevent plants from taking up enough nutrients and water for themselves and really just serve as a place for the nematodes to have a wonderful time and get all the food that they want and reproduce in grand numbers. So the idea with the tomato and the marigold planting is that you might find that marigolds planted near tomatoes reduce some of the effects of these pathogens like nematodes. And indeed, there are several studies out there that show that marigolds are able to suppress up to 14 different species of nematodes, including root knot nematodes, which are increasingly having detrimental effects on tomatoes grown here in Indiana, and in some cases, in particular, in high tunnels. So the mechanism behind this is that marigolds are exuding a chemical called alpha terthioneol, if I'm saying that correctly, through their roots, which happens to be toxic to insects, nematodes, and other life forms. And nematodes are so small that even a small amount of a chemical like this could potentially cause them to fail to thrive or to be killed. So Marigold's ability to suppress root knot nematode and other nematodes like lesion nematodes may vary somewhat depending on the type of marigold, soil temperature, and a handful of other factors. But we can say that the marigold and tomato companion planting relationship is one that has been shown through scientific evidence to work well. So if you do have a problem with root knot nematode, maybe consider planting marigolds in with your tomatoes. And also, if you are having root knot nematode issues, we do have a nematologist here at Purdue, Lei Zhang, who can potentially provide some advice to you or maybe get you involved in some research to help figure out why you are having nematode issues, particularly in tomatoes. So the next example that we'll take a look at is one of the flavor and scent improvement examples. So there are lots of anecdotes out there where gardeners report that growing basil near their tomato plants is going to improve the flavor of the tomato. However, there is limited research on this, and I was unable to find any scientific studies that show evidence to support that this phenomenon is occurring. So, using the scientific method and doing some of this kind of sensory work to see if basil is improving tomato flavor, that hasn't really been done. Maybe the reason why folks think that basil near tomatoes improves tomato flavor is and purely a sensory thing where you're harvesting each of these crops at the same time and both are fresh enough that you just assume that these two plants planted together are improving the flavor of each other. But we don't really have evidence to support this. Um, this is something that is very much perception related and that can be difficult to study. So maybe let's consider this one debunked for now, unless we hear further information later on. However, there is a study out there that supports a different type of relationship between basil and tomato that is influencing insects. So, Yoshida et al. In 2024 reported that tomato plants grown with a basil companion crop were more rapidly able to defend themselves against attack from an insect called tomato cutworm, so the larva of this insect. So, basil produces an essential oil that essentially primes the tomatoes to defend itself better through a signaling process. So it's actually kind of exciting to see that there's some evidence to support this. Now, I will say that the experiment is primarily done in a greenhouse in pots. So translating a greenhouse study into something that's done in the field, there are some potential hurdles to jump when you're going from a greenhouse study to a field study because as soon as you're in the field, you're exposed to a whole bunch of other variables. But there are a lot of greenhouse grown tomatoes in the world, and maybe there's cause to interplant some basil in case there are any insect pests that get in the greenhouse, or maybe you're growing in a high tunnel where insect pests like this tomato cutworm can make their way in, and you're in a slightly more controlled environment. So I think we can consider this one a check mark for us that there is an established relationship between basil and tomatoes as companion plants specifically for this cutworm insect. Another companion planting suggestion is planting eggplant and amaranth together. This is a suggestion that's made in the Louise Riot book that I mentioned earlier this evening. And specifically, the two species that are suggested for planting in this companion planting with eggplant are either redroot pigweed or amaranth. And redroot pigweed, you may know it as a weed. It is a fairly common weed throughout the Midwest, and it's one that is a cousin to Palmer amaranth and water hemp. It's not necessarily a weed that we want to deal with on the farm or in the garden because they grow really rapidly, they're adapted to warm temperatures, and they can be a pain in the butt to pull up. But the companion planting anecdotes that we see about this is that redroot pigweed is said to loosen the soil around the eggplants or even other crops like radishes with the roots of the redroot pigweed. And I've not been able to uncover any scientific studies that support or refute this suggestion. So I'd say that the jury is out on this. But on the other hand, I would question whether or not you would want to intentionally plant a weedy species if you're going the redroot pigweed route in your garden. Maybe you choose to plant amaranth and you're going to harvest that for cut flower for the seeds or something along those lines, and that would be more acceptable. But I would prefer not to spread the idea that deliberately introducing weedy species that may invade the rest of the garden is a responsible companion planting strategy. So I'm going to give this one an X for not a good established relationship. So another popular one, and we'll see this theme in companion planting resources pretty frequently, is that if you plant an allium crop like an onion, a garlic, or a leek, and plant that with another crop, maybe it's carrot, maybe it's something else, there's an idea that carrot flies and therefore their maggots will be repelled by those onions, garlic, or leeks, or those alliums. So um, there's an idea that maybe the onions are producing a type of compound that is keeping those insects from being able to from keeping those insects from being able to reach the cash crop in question. So, while I was unable to find a study that specifically looks at the relationship between carrots and alliums, one study that I came across from 2003 by Finch et al. Attempted to untangle this companion planting dynamic between so-called aromatic plants, really looking at plants like peppermint and other herbs that are producing some of these volatile compounds, and its relationship with cabbage root fly and onion fly pressure. So, one idea is that peppermints and other similar herbs are producing enough scent and volatile compounds that they can mask the desirable host plant. And in this case, they were comparing the herb and onions. So, actually taking a look at onions as the susceptible crop instead of onions being the crop to mask. So this study found that pest pressure wasn't significantly different for any type of companion plant that they studied. So they looked at aromatic, non-aromatic, and even the presence of weeds as a potential companion plant. What they ended up finding is that the main difference between pressure in these different treatments, so aromatic, non-aromatic weeds, and a control treatment, they found that the main difference was with plants that were simply planted nearby, disrupting the fly's ability to land on the onion and lay its eggs. So it was mostly an effect of a physical barrier that caused fewer flies to land and lay eggs than it was a chemical compound being released into the environment. So you may also hear about other herbs such as rosemary being able to mask a cash crop from a potential pest species. And I think there's some evidence to support that, but I didn't deep dive into rosemary specifically when putting this information together for you today. But it's looking like your mileage may vary with this one. This may vary depending on your environment, the season, the temperature. It seems like there might be further study to do to figure out what some of these relationships might be and what the actual mechanism of that relationship is, whether it's a physical barrier, volatile compounds, etc., that are actually causing a positive relationship to be formed. So, another sensory one for you this evening. So, this is another suggestion. It's actually on the title of the Riot book that we talked about earlier. So, there's some growers out there in the ornamental world that suggest that growing alliums like onions, leeks, and garlic next to rose bushes will produce a stronger scent from the rose bush. And while it sounds good, unfortunately, I was unable to uncover any research that supports this. But maybe it is another one of those sensory things where if you plant an onion, which has its own strong smell, next to a rose bush, which has a very different type of strong smell, maybe that proximity is just tricking your nose into thinking that the roses smell better than they ordinarily would. So I'd be curious to know, maybe drop it in the chat if you've had any experiences with roses and planting alliums with roses, and if you have noticed any effects there. But again, this one isn't necessarily supported by evidence, so we're going to give this one an X for now. Maybe a sensory study will be done at some point to see if this relationship can be proven or disproven. However, there's another relationship to discuss with onions and roses. So there's some gardeners and farmers that will report that alliums may prevent roses from catching black spot and aphids. So there's specific aphids that will attack rose bushes and cause some damage, as well as this black spot disease that will attack rose bushes specifically. And while I have not been able to uncover any research studies that either support or refute these two claims, I can offer some insight about the aphids and the fungal disease black spot. So, black spot specifically is a fungal disease in which the spores are spread on the wind. And infection typically takes place early in the season when the leaves of the roses are emerging. So the leaves are young and vulnerable at this time. This is a time when, in many other types of plants, if a fungal disease is floating through on the wind, that fungal disease may take hold on a younger leaf and then not show symptoms until a little bit later in the season. So, because of the way that the disease works, this fungal disease, I would say there's little reasoning to suggest and support the idea that the alliums would have any effect on black spot infection rates in roses. Maybe there's something to be investigated there, but just based on the way that disease works, I have trouble puzzling out exactly how an allium might be able to prevent black spot from taking hold on a rose bush, especially early in the season when you may not have transplanted onions anyway. It is possible, however, that alliums might produce enough of a volatile chemical to maybe deter aphids from feeding on roses, but there's no studies that support or refute this claim either. So we're going to say that your mileage may vary with this particular option. So nasturtiums are a really popular option for companion plantings. There's a variety of anecdotes about nasturtiums in general, but for the most part, suggestions are that nasturtiums will repel a variety of aphids, or squash bugs, or cucumber beetles. So there's a wide variety of insects that purportedly are deterred or repelled by nasturtium plants. Um, Sources are really mixed on this. So there have been some studies done that involve nasturtium, but either nasturtium wasn't the star of the study, it wasn't the only plant used as a companion plant, or maybe it was intermixed with some other companion plants, or the studies are not necessarily looking at nasturtium as a primary variable, or they're not looking at companion planting specifically. So I think that there's probably more research to be done with nasturtium. And at the end of the day, it also looks like there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that you shouldn't plant nasturtium in your garden or on your farm. It is an edible plant. It is a neat looking plant. It can provide a value add for your farm. So there's no reason maybe not to try it out, but there's mixed results from the research that does exist on whether nasturtium is actually providing a companion benefit to any of the plantings on the farm. So we're going to give that one a your mileage may vary for this evening. An interesting potential pairing to consider is horseradish and potato. So, if you've ever grown potatoes before, you know that Colorado potato beetle is a particularly annoying issue that we tend to see, especially after potatoes have been planted in a particular site for more than a couple of years. Um, the idea here is that horseradish being pungent and producing some compounds that make it taste spicy and deter herbivores from feeding on it. Could also be a deterrent to insects like Colorado potato beetle. So it's thought to be that if you plant horseradish near a potato bed, that horseradish might be able to deter Colorado potato beetle. However, I was unable to uncover research studies looking at this specific relationship. And Colorado potato beetle, based on IPM guidelines that have been produced by research over the years, and that you can find out more about in extension publications from a variety of states throughout the US, it's an insect that requires some pretty targeted management strategies. So, a variety of strategies must be used, particularly in organic growing situations. That includes crop rotation, timely applications of insecticide, which might include products like Entrust, active ingredient there is spinosad, and other factors, other tools like floating row covers and applications of other biocontrols like Bovaria bassiana or Bacillus thuringiensis or BT. So usually Colorado potato beetle management requires a multi-pronged approach. Also, horseradish, in my experience, has a propensity for being a little bit aggressive. So when you plant it in an area, you might have it in that area for a long time. So this one might be a companion planting suggestion to skip for now, unless we find out that there are uh, compounds in horseradish that Colorado potato beetle really don't like. But so far, it seems like you'll have to find a different way to manage your Colorado potato beetle other than just relying on a companion plant. So another companion planting option you might consider includes garlic and brassicas. So brassicas being a broad term to describe a variety of vegetables like kale, cabbage, and so on. Broccoli, cauliflower. There's a lot of different vegetables that fall into the brassica category. So brassica is the plant family that all of those vegetables fall into, and most of them are actually essentially the same species, just different varieties selected for different characteristics. Like kale is selected for its leaves, kohlrabi is selected for its stem, and so on. So there was a study from Yang et al. In January of 2025, so this one's pretty hot off the presses, that showed some evidence that garlic interplanted with brassicas such as kale, cabbage, bok choy, etc., can reduce the survival and reproductive ability of an aphid called the green peach aphid, which is a fairly common aphid, doesn't just feed on peaches, it feeds on tons of different fruit and vegetable crops and is pretty ubiquitous in plantings around the Midwest. It's also known as a vector of several different plant diseases, mostly viruses that like to hang out in its mouth parts. And those viruses can affect a lot of different crops like cucumber, pepper, potato, peach, tomato, tobacco, and more. So the idea that we could use a companion plant to influence the green peach aphid is pretty attractive. So garlic has some characteristics that make it allelopathic. So allelopathic meaning this plant produces chemicals that may influence the growth and survival and or reproduction of other organisms. And also these chemicals might serve as a deterrent, which we would define as keeping pests away or keeping them from entering an area, but not necessarily killing them. So it's exciting to see that there's some evidence that supports this as a companion planting option. So if for any of the studies that I've mentioned, I'd be happy to send you out the listing where you can go and look at the primary literature there. We've got some citations in this presentation. I just didn't put them out in the resources page. So if you would like to see any more information on that, don't hesitate to let me know in the chat or at the end during a brief Q&A. We've also got a variety of herbs available as companion plants, and there are several herbs out there that have been suggested as companion plants for various reasons and purposes. So some herbs that you might see listed as potential companion planting options include fennel, dill, oregano, thyme, and yarrow. And each of these has been shown through other research to be really important floral resources for a variety of predator insects that we like to have in the farm or in the garden. So, one of these predators that you see pictured here is the hoverfly, otherwise known as syrphid flies. And other types of predator insects like parasitoid wasps are also something that are going to be hanging out at flowers on herbs and other plants that you might have around the farm, including native plants. So when these types of plants are incorporated into the farm or incorporated into the garden, they're going to help support predator populations that will then in turn feed on a wide variety of pests. So parasitoids tend to be pretty pest specific in my understanding. They're going to target specific species of pests or caterpillars, whereas hoverflies, ladybug larvae, some of those are going to be more generalist. So they're going to feed on other types, more than one type of pest insect. And it's important to remember that while predators don't fully eliminate pest insect populations, having more predators around are going to at least help suppress populations, hopefully to a level that is tolerable and a level that is below the economic threshold of treatment. So, if you're not familiar with the term economic threshold, that is a term that we use to describe when it is more cost effective to treat the pest than it is to leave it alone. And in many cases, the economic threshold for insect damage is a lot higher than you might expect. So it's actually more cost effective for you to take a little bit of a yield hit and leave the pests alone than it would be to actually get out there and purchase a product and spend the time and labor on applying that product. So having more predator insects, more beneficials that are predators around can help you maintain a pest population that is below the economic threshold and may prevent you from having to apply a product at all. So we're going to call that a solid relationship between herbs and various vegetables that are out there that you might have on the farm or in the garden. That is a good relationship. So coriander and cabbage. This is a one that I think is particularly interesting. So coriander, also known as cilantro. Cilantro is the leafy version of the herb. Coriander is what happens when you allow cilantro to go to seed and you harvest the seed. So, a study in New Zealand by Morris and Lee back in 2000 suggests that coriander attracts enough hoverflies to suppress aphid and caterpillar populations early in the growing season, particularly when planted closer to cabbages rather than farther away. So, this was a study that was conducted at a site in Japan and a site in New Zealand. So, while it's important to keep in mind that climate conditions will vary and hemispheres apparently will vary in a study like this. There are some conclusions that we can likely draw that could apply potentially here in the Midwest, even though this study was conducted far away and on island nations that are in different hemispheres. So there are still some comparisons that we could potentially apply where we are, or at least try it out and see if it works. So basically, what the study showed is that if cilantro or coriander was planted within 1 meter, about a yard or so of cabbages, that they attracted enough hoverflies to their flowers to help keep some of the pest population in check. So I think that's particularly exciting. This is something that maybe you try out, maybe you find out that this is something that's helpful on your farm or in your garden. So we're going to call that one a positive relationship, even though it is fairly narrow, just specifically controlling for certain caterpillars and certain aphids. It's still something that can't hurt. So, a more recent development, so sweet alyssum is a plant that you might have heard about. It's becoming more popular these days in small and diversified farms across the Midwest, and particularly here in Indiana, in high tunnel situations. And there are a couple of researchers here at Purdue, so Robert Grodidier and Laura Ingwell here at Purdue are in one of the entomology labs here on campus, and they have recently been conducting some research on sweet alyssum planted as a companion plant with crops like strawberry. So what you see here pictured in the slide is sweet alyssum there on the right. That's that white flower in the background. and strawberry in the foreground. So just a strawberry start. It's probably the first year of growth for that strawberry. And the idea here is that sweet alyssum attracts a wide variety of insects to its flowers, and it flowers pretty prolifically even early in the season. So it attracts all kinds of insects. What you can see here in the background, there is a yellow sticky card that is used for trapping insects so that our entomologists can record how many insects of a particular species have visited the area. And you can see there are tons and tons of flies, just your regular old flies that have been stuck to that sticky card. So it just goes to show that one, flies are an important pollinator early in the season because they're some of the first to emerge after the long winter. And two, flies are having a really great time hanging out on that alyssum. So, in addition to flies, the Ingwell lab has found that other beneficial insects like the syrphid or hoverflies that we talked about earlier and the parasitoid wasps that we talked about earlier tend to be visiting the sweet alyssum and providing some pest control for the strawberries that are planted in the tunnel. So, because they're finding that greater abundance of hoverflies and parasitoid wasps, there's likely reason to believe that it's potentially a good thing to plant in your high tunnel to provide some floral resources for these insects that might be providing a service to you. So, you can find out more about this research on Facts for Fancy Fruit, which is a Purdue horticulture newsletter publication that you can sign up for. So the link to that is at the bottom of the slide here. And I'll also mention it in our resources at the end of the presentation. So pole beans and beets. So I wanted to mention an example of a companion planting pair that is generally not recommended by the traditional resources. So companion planting manuals are generally going to steer farmers and gardeners away from planting beets with pole beans. And that is for a variety of reasons. One of those reasons being that they'll compete too much with each other for water and nutrients, and that the beets will be shaded out too much by the pole beans. But this is an anecdote I will share with you. This is one of those things where your mileage may vary, and there's not a research study to necessarily support this one way or the other. But what we have found at the Purdue Student Farm is that there can be success in planting these two crops together. So here you see beets that are interplanted with pole beans. So the beets are here along the soil surface, and the pole beans, which are a Chinese red noodle bean, are growing trellised in the high tunnel. And beets here are benefiting from the shading provided by the pole beans because it does get hot in high tunnels. And if the beets can get a little bit of shade, which they're good at tolerating, they can get a little bit of shade to help with water stress from the pole beans, and then the beets can help protect the pole beans from weeds that might be overly competitive. So you can see there are some grass weeds in the high tunnel. This is an organically managed farm, so some weed control is not going to look the same as it would on a conventional farm. But in general, it's doing a pretty good job in the situation of the beets. The beets are doing a good job of shading out some of those grasses in the high tunnel. So just because a companion planting guide might suggest that a pairing is not a good idea, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try it as long as you are providing plant health to the plants that you're growing. So as long as you're fertilizing things appropriately, watering appropriately, it's not necessarily a bad idea to try something that a companion planting guide might be suggesting. So again, your mileage may vary, as it would with some of the other suggestions that a companion planting guide might suggest against. So that's just something to keep in mind. Another experiment that we are conducting here on campus that involves some companion planting is a study that's taking place at Northeast Purdue Ag Center. So this is an experimental look at companion planting in grain crops where we have cowpea growing with field corn. And while this isn't the point of the study that's going on out there, this study is more related to entomology and what what different characteristics of the insect and arthropod community are going to look like with two different crop rotation comparisons out there. it is still part of the experiment to intercrop cowpea and corn in one of the crop rotations. And it's similar to the Three Sisters. The corn is providing a scaffolding for the cowpea to climb on and access more light, and the cowpea is returning some nitrogen to the soil. So this planting is part of an experiment that's taking place at Northeast Purdue Ag Center on about 12 of the 30 certified organic acres that we have out there. So this is another one where your mileage may vary, but it is part of an experiment. So maybe we'll have some data to share that may support or refute the idea that cowpea and corn are good to plant together in a row crop situation. What I can report back on, however, is that cowpea did not interfere with corn harvest in a mechanized sense. So this plot is harvested with a combine, like any other field corn crop would be harvested. And the cowpea did not present an issue when it comes to adding too much fodder to the combine hopper or getting in the way or dropping too much cowpea seed into the corn crop. So just some ideas to kind of summarize why companion planting looks the way that it does. So some of the suggestions that come out of companion planting guides are kind of coming back to these general ideas that, for example, heavy feeders should not be planted near other heavy feeders. So we don't want two crops that feed heavily to compete with each other too much for nutrients, water, or sunlight. Some other ideas that we can generalize. Some crops are likely attracting different microbes and potentially antagonistic microbes than other crops might. So planting two crops together and one suffers, maybe that's because of a microbial relationship going on in the soil. Some crops are going to fix nitrogen that others may access, so that's a positive relationship between two crops, kind of like the cowpea and corn or the pole beans and corn and the Three Sisters planting. There's the idea that different root architecture with two different plants are going to improve soil physical properties that will benefit both plants in the long run. Then there's this idea that really seems like most of the examples that are talked about and that we talked about this evening are that companion plantings are going to influence insects in a certain way. And this may be true, but are they influencing insects in the way that we want them to? Are they repelling the correct pest? Are they attracting the correct beneficial? Is the beneficial actually doing anything? Is the right prey present for that beneficial insect to interact with? So, lots of different potential insect ideas that float around with companion planting. And similarly, companion plantings may attract pollinators that will have a positive influence on the cash crop at hand. So, lots of different potential insect ideas that are kind of generalizable across companion plantings. So, a few potential drawbacks of companion planting. One I mentioned earlier is that mechanical harvest can be more difficult and potentially even hand harvest when there's a lot of different crops that are grown in the same area together. So, that's something to be cognizant of when you're planning out a potential companion planting. There's also the issue of crop rotation planning. So crop rotation planning will become more complex and detailed the more plants you're adding to your crop rotation. And if you're adding companion plantings, that means you have multiple species of multiple families potentially growing in the same area, but that will influence what species you're able to plant there next time around. Also, tight spacing. So, thinking about the beets and the pole beans as an example, tight spacing can reduce airflow and increase the incidence of certain plant diseases. So, fungi tend to thrive in humid environments where air is not moving well. So, that's something to keep in mind when you're choosing spacing of your companion plantings. It's important to understand how the tight spacing might influence the planting. It's important to understand the plant architecture. If you're planting two tall things with big leaves next to each other that will be touching each other, that might not be so good for airflow or humidity either. So, what I want to leave you with on the companion planting side of things is that companion planting falls into both categories of fact and fiction. So, it all depends on what companion plants we're talking about. And also, crop rotation and integrated pest management should always be considered and should always be informing your choices when it comes to companion planting. So I have a few resources to share with you related to that. I'm going to skip forward. We have some cover crop information in this slide set as well, but in the interest of time, we are going to pass through that information very quickly. So I'm actually going to stop sharing and skip forward to where I want to be so I don't we don't get too over animated here. I will say that cover crops are an excellent option for a companion plant in many farming scenarios. And we have a variety of resources available for you to explore when it comes to cover crops. Let me share this to you here. So our cover crop resources include Cover Crops in the Home Garden, which is a bulletin from Purdue Extension, the Managing Cover Crops Profitably publication from SARE, which if you go to SARE's website, you can download the entire PDF of this publication for free. You can read it on your Kindle, you can read it on a tablet, or you can print it out and throw it in a binder. You can also purchase a print version of this. Same thing with crop rotation on organic farms. This is probably my favorite resource that I use in my professional work. There is a giant spreadsheet in the back of this book that shows every potential interaction of crop sequences that you could imagine. So if you are going to follow an onion crop with potatoes, there are some potential interactions that might take place when it comes to insect or pest pressure or disease pressure that you should consider as you're planning your crop rotation. It also includes all of the cover crops. So I highly encourage you to take a look at that one. Also available for free as a PDF download, or you can purchase a copy. And then finally, there's the Midwest Cover Crops Field Guide that can provide you with some planting information, different characteristics of each of the cover crops, and the seasonality of cover crops as well. And as we are wrapping up, I would also like to share with you some of our newsletter options. And honestly, the best thing you can do here is to Google each of these to find the sign-in page for each of these to sign up for these newsletters. The first one is the Purdue Diversified Farming and Food Systems monthly newsletter. The target audience there is anybody who is working on a diversified farm, maybe running a small scale operation with a wide variety of crops and livestock. Also, urban farmers are encouraged to sign up for this newsletter. The next few are here housed here in Purdue Horticulture and Landscape Architecture. So the Purdue Vegetable Crops Hotline, Purdue Facts for Fancy Fruit, and the Purdue Organic Grain Listserv are all housed here in horticulture. The Vegetable Crops Hotline comes out every 2 weeks during the growing season and provides you with some updates on the latest that's going on in Indiana and the region when it comes to vegetable production. Generally geared a bit more toward commercial growers, but there are plenty of resources there for anybody growing at any scale. Same thing for Facts for Fancy Fruit, which is where you can find the article about sweet alyssum and strawberries from the Ingwell Lab. And then the Purdue Organic Grain Listserv is a contact list that I maintain where I share out information that is relevant to organic grain producers around the state and advertise events that we have going on that is associated with Purdue's Organic Ag Extension program, which I am a part of. And then before we conclude, I just want to mention again, the Indiana Organic Network is supporting this webinar. There are lots of ways to get involved with the network. We maintain an email list, so if you would like to be part of that, which I believe many of you on the webinar this evening are already a part of, please let me know, or if you'd like to get someone else signed up, we can add you to the list. And then Ion is involved with a variety of different events throughout the year, including more webinars. So we've got a couple of grain-focused webinars coming up later in the season. So we've got one on organics transition in July, and then a special topics webinar coming up in November. So I would like to leave you with my contact information. I'm available via email or phone for any organic questions that you may have. I'm happy to consult with you on organic issues such as organic certification, or organic management and production techniques. Really anything that you can think of that's related to organic management, whether that's certified organic, certified naturally grown, or you're just practicing organic practices without a certification of any kind. I am happy to help. So I'm going to take a look at the chat here. It looks like Brian dropped a couple of links in there for you. So our organic transition for specialty crops recording, as well as our resources page, and also the link to our Sweet Alyssum article that was posted earlier this May. So if you want to take a look at any of those resources, feel free to grab those out of the chat. And please feel free to reach out if you have any questions in the future.